Greetings. It is Friday, July 24th, 2020. I'm Mahan Mirza, Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome to our online conversation series, Engaged, Religion and the Common Good. As we get started, we invite you to join the conversation by visiting our website or following us on Twitter at AnsariUND. We are engaged today with Azza Karam. Dr. Karam was joyously affirmed by acclamation as the Secretary General for Religions for Peace in August of last year. She is also a professor of religion and development at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. She has served in various capacities at the United Nations, including the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, and the UN's Strategic Learning Exchanges on Religion, Development, and Diplomacy. We're also delighted to have Professor Karam on our advisory board at the Ansari Institute. Thank you, Azza, for taking the time to be with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for doing this entire series.
Thank you so much. So let's start out with a recent blog that you wrote. And in that blog, you say that religions are the quintessential double-edged sword. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Religions are what we would say deeply held. They contain everything about deeply held values, the innermost sacred values in every single person, sometimes in cultures and civilizations. And as such, this is the potential. Beliefs in general are the potential to be the best good and the worst bad, quite frankly, depending entirely on what it is that we do with them as human beings. Religions or our belief systems are things that we learn from, many of us believe, the divine, right? Either direct or through intermediaries, messengers, what have you. So they have all the values we're meant to live with, and we're meant to exercise and practice. And just as we err in our everyday life, we also, in a sense, err with how we use or abuse our values, slash our beliefs, slash our religions. That's the intentionality that is being looked at here. And we can do plenty good with what we believe. We can also do plenty harm with what.
So, if religion can do both of these things, what's the value of religion? So I'm thinking of a quote that these new atheists, they often mention, which is that, good people do good things, and bad people do bad things, but it's only religion that can make good people do really bad things. What do you say? What do you say to that?
I think that's really simple. I think we have to, when we speak about religions, we have to be very clear what we mean, because there are values that we believe in, but there are also institutions that are meant to embody those values or to help propagate them or to support us in the ritual practice of them. So it's the beliefs, the institutions, and the modality in which these institutions function. And then there are the leaders who are supposedly the ones most knowledgeable about these faith traditions. So the world of religion, when we say the word religion, we actually are embodying all of that, plus average, ordinary, everyday believers. So honestly, we would have to sort of be clear what we mean, which aspect of it. I think it's important to distinguish also because we all know that institutions tend to have their own dynamic and their own, and very few institutions are pure and holistic and absolutely wonderful. The dynamic of an institution in and of itself requires prioritizing something even before the belief. It requires prioritizing institutions. Sometimes the institution becomes the religion. In the same way that you can talk about a secular institution that has extraordinarily fantastic values, like the United Nations system or the European Union or a government. Their values are very good. The values of any governance institution are supposed to be very good, but do they necessarily function that well? I think an institution has its own dynamic and culture, even when it's supposed to embody specific values. So if we're talking about religious institutions, we're talking about a totally different thing here. Certainly with the capacity to do good, but also very much with the capacity to have the same organizational weaknesses that come with an institution, with any institution. And so it is important for us to be able to distinguish and not just put everything in one bag and say, this is religion, it's all bad, throw it out.
So when it comes to COVID-19, which edge of the sword would you say has been sharper? Has religion been, done more harm or more good during the pandemic? And is it even possible, like, how do you assess this?
I think it's important to acknowledge that COVID, because of its very nature as a disease that's hard to see or to grasp or to know where it's going to go next, or to, it has created a tremendous amount of insecurity. It has jolted us physically, character-wise, economically, politically. It has jolted all of us. And there is, as a result, a significant amount of insecurity that has been increased. With increased insecurity comes, I think, many repercussions. Two are diametrically opposite. You see people who rush to do good, to care for one another, to heal, to save. You also see people becoming extraordinarily mean and nasty, and very much focused on themselves and at the expense of others, etc. You see both trends of humanity, the very, very good and the very, very not so good. And I think that where religions are is what people do with them again. And I think it's interesting to see how many people have wanted to come to their faith, to retrieve the principles of their faith. They found solace in the religious practice, ritual, wording. A lot of people have found their faith to be extraordinarily important right now. They're the main backbone that they now have in the midst of all this insecurity. A lot of religious institutions are saying, yes, we're actually reporting online increased attendance at services, which is an interesting phenomenon, because we were all thinking, okay, now we can't go to the mosque or to the church anymore. What's that going to mean? Well, interestingly, plenty of these online ritual services are witnessing an uptake. Then there's a bigger congregation in many parts of the world where the medium of virtual communication is widespread and available. So clearly, a lot of people have, if you will, found faith to be a solace, a space of solace and security.
Yeah.
And there's another phenomenon which we don't often hear about, which is that the truth of the matter is that many health service providers in many parts of the world, including the so-called developed world, are actually faith-based. So in other words, church-run or church-administered hospitals in this part of the world, the Western Hemisphere, is a very normal phenomenon. We don't even realize that this is a church or a religiously based inspired institution. You know, Presbyterian Colombia. Oh yeah, Presbyterian. Wait a minute, isn't that supposed to be a really? You know, we don't even think about it. Here in the United States, 70% of the hospitals are actually run by or through the Catholic Church. So if this is the case in the so-called developed, which we do need to question now after COVID as a status, but if that's the case in the so-called developed context, you can well imagine that in the developing world, we know that a significant part of the healthcare service providers are actually faith-based and faith-inspired institutions are being run through there. So there's a very critical element of religiously inspired social services as part of the normal infrastructure of services in the world that is now seriously activated in order to serve what is clearly beyond the capacity of state-run hospitals and state-run healthcare, clearly. So here's what has got activated even more, which is religiously run health service provision. That is not the same as us feeling, you know, we need God in our lives. Let's follow ritual, whatever. So they're distinct realities. And I think what COVID has done is it has, in a sense, here in New York, in Central Park, Samaritan's Purse set up an additional a medical facility in the middle of Central Park. Samaritan's Purse is a Christian organization. Why was it Samaritan's Purse? Because they had the resources, they could do it, and there was a huge need at the time when New York was the epicenter. So in a sense, what COVID has done is it has pushed to the forefront the absolute need that these religiously inspired health services provide. So now we're more aware of the fact that we need them more. We need them much more than we did before because our state-run and even privately run hospitals are overflowing. So those are two really clear phenomena I think that you can see. It's difficult for me to say it's all good because obviously the examples I've given you are very good examples where religion is a spiritual sustenance in times of insecurity, and the religious institutions are providing healthcare at a rate because they're necessary and they're needed. The other part of it is what I've experienced in Religions for Peace is the humanitarian side. I had this extraordinarily naive assumption that the religious institutions who are some of the first responders in humanitarian crises around the world, and the 4 of the top 10 humanitarian organizations in the world are actually religiously inspired organizations, faith-based NGOs, we call them. I had thought, COVID is going to be this moment of reckoning where we will come together across the different religious, so the Catholic and the Protestant and the Muslim and the Jewish and the Hindu, and we're going to pool their resources. And here's an opportunity for all of us to actually work together, pool the resources so that we can serve more and serve better, especially since we're all needing to serve all at the same time. That's what a global pandemic requires. And I think it was a big moment of reckoning to realize that, no, it doesn't quite work like that. It doesn't quite work. That this global pandemic will get us to collaborate more and better. So the response that came from all the faith-inspired humanitarian providers was, well, we've got our own services and we're busy running around like crazy trying to make sure that they are better staffed and better resourced and more efficient because the need is so high. Why would we need to pool resources and get into all that mess of who's doing what and who's keeping the money and who's no. Thank you. We're serving, and we're serving everybody. Why do we need to do this thing? I mean, what more coordination? Seriously, we're barely able to do what we're doing right here, and we need more to do more ourselves. Why would we try to pool our efforts together?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, the question comes to mind is, if we can't do it now,
when will we ever do it?
Will we be able to do it? And what's coming to, the image that's coming to my mind is like of a highway as you're talking, and everyone's in their lane and traffic is flowing, and we need a new infrastructure. We need to build new kind of transportation system. But in order to do that, we have to stop. And if we stop, people will die. And so we can't stop to build something new and better.
Except that you don't need to stop, and nobody needs to die, actually, because what Religions for Peace did is it said, we'll take on board all the hassle and of putting it together, of the coordination, of the management. You just give us your basic needs and guidelines. We will do this. We will. This will be Religions for Peace's contribution. We don't have money to put in, but we can be your organizational infrastructure. We're happy to serve you all as you pool your resources and your efforts and direct them with an intentionality to be serving more, serving all better. Let us help you do that. So there wasn't going to be a need to stop anything at all. There was going to be a need to share, however, which is the very basic fundament of all faith traditions. Share. You've got to share. So here's this global pandemic moment, and the point is share some of what you're doing. You don't have to stop doing anything at all, but you need to, as you serve, put some of that aside so that can go to this mechanism that's going to make sure that it's the Presbyterians and the other kinds of Protestants and the Muslims and the Hindus and the Buddhists support that's going so that you can do more with that amount of money that you're still serving. You can do more elsewhere too, with everyone else. That was apparently much too much, which, by the way, if you think about it, that's how the UN coordination happens. UN OCHA happens because they pool and they then serve, regardless of context or time or whatever. So now the idea was to say, okay, let's do it as religious NGOs working in the humanitarian space. Let's pool, coordinate, and serve together better. But I think it was a radical idea because it then questioned the very notion that, what you mean, are you trying to say that I'm not serving everybody anyway? Of course I'm serving. I'm not discriminating between Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or I'm serving everyone who needs. Yes, that's true, but you're one organization. What if it were 10 working together to serve? Where on earth do we come up with this notion that that's just too much work when we're all facing a global pandemic? How do we justify and legitimize to ourselves that we didn't want to share?
So what do you think is the reason for this? Like at the very core?
I think that the same thing that we were talking about, the best and the worst of human tendencies come out in these kinds of situations. And I really do think that the test was, are you ready to collaborate at this moment when there is a highest need? Are you ready to share some of what presumably is your own glory that you're going to get in serving? In this case, it's in serving. It's the glory of service. Are you ready to share some of that glory of service? Or is this a really good moment to show that my organization is doing so much? Will you share that glory of this, or will you not? And are you ready to pay the price of sharing? Because you share at the price. A little bit more time, a little bit of your money going less to your own and more to others. It was a quintessential test of just how willing are we as organizations to share that particular glory.
So do you think that religion here, as it's operating in these institutions, even institutions that are charitable and doing good, they're being instrumentalized for some other purposes?
I think this is the institutionalization that I was talking about earlier. Institutions, per definition, are not philanthropic businesses. Even when they are, they're not operated as such. Even when an institution is a philanthropic institution, it doesn't mean that it's going to be all good, doing wonderfully all the time with angels working in it. Never, never. No institutions is populated by angels unless we're talking about where God resides and where heaven and hell are supposed to be. But really, in truth, on our earth, institutions are populated by human beings. And the logic of an institution is, this institution has to exist. What do I need to make sure it will exist, and not just exist, but thrive? That logic, even when the institution is geared for the best of all humanity, the logic of an institution requires a notion of survival and therefore of some kind of a profit. Maybe not monetary profit, because that's why we call them not-for-profits. But there's a profitability inherent in an institution's survival and in its thrival, being able to thrive. And ironically, stress, horrible situations that are facing the world are also an opportunity to showcase the institution's capacity. We've got to do really well here, because if people see us, they will see us, and that will give us more credibility afterwards. That's an institutional way of thinking. That's not a religious way of thinking. It's an institutional way of thinking. And what we're seeing happen across the board is that the institutions need to survive. One of the impacts of the global pandemic, economically, financially, is that really institutions are threatened, very much so. Many of them are. So then the struggle to keep your institution going has actually become more, not less, in a context of a pandemic. How do you make sure you can keep this institution running? You have to make sure that there's a demand, that there's a need, that there's an impossibility of not existing, that there's a cutting edge over somebody else who's doing something very similar. That institutional marketing way of thinking has nothing to do with the principles of the institution.
Yeah, so I'm seeing parallels on the reopening debate for colleges. That, you know, there's this debate going on, is what's driving this push to reopen, you know, is it in the genuine interest of the students, the faculty, and the staff, or are we just afraid that, you know, people will be able to
shut down very quickly if we don't get the students back in here again?
And people will find a new way of maybe educating themselves or feel comfortable, maybe learning in different ways. And that'll undermine the very reason that the institution exists in the first place in the way that it does presently.
I think that that's to a large extent very true. I think institutions are facing what the pandemic may be doing is actually confronting all kinds of institutions with a very, very basic survival question. Are we going to make it through this or not? And as you know, many businesses have shut down, including businesses that were serving communities, doing really good things. It's not that if you are doing good stuff, you can make this through. No. And it's not that if you have the best of principles and values, you're going to make it through. No. Institutions are struggling. And they were struggling before the pandemic, by the way. We were talking already before the pandemic about the very serious crisis of legitimacy that even government institutions were confronting, that political parties, the trade unions, the labor movement, you name it. We were already talking about this. We were already quoting facts and figures and the challenge of actually maintaining any movement that has an institutional structure. There were already challenges of legitimacy, of credibility, of efficacy and efficiency. So what the pandemic has done is just move that fast forward and made it widespread to every single other institution.
Yeah. And I think the big question then here is the rush to go back to normal, where we know that there are systemic changes and systemic injustices, whereas this was an opportunity to maybe just actually hit the pause button and build something better. Institutions, because of their logic, need to do their best to just start up business as usual as quickly as possible in order to survive.
They do need to continue to survive as institutions. The survival of all kinds of institutions is at stake thanks to the pandemic, which means that we will hear all kinds of arguments that are there. What if, just think about it, if you're unable to deliver, or your capacity to deliver what it is that you are supposed to do is hampered, your very existence is then in question. So how do you make sure that you can continue to deliver? That's the main question, right? If that was your purpose, which is really the purpose of most institutions. Otherwise, we won't need them at all. We won't need institutions. We need the institution in order to structure a mode of delivery,
right?
Of some kind of service or some kind of need. And right now, I think all institutions are being very, very concerned about whether they are able to deliver that which they were created for.
So this is very interesting. I hadn't anticipated, going in this direction, but I want to press this a little bit so let's make you like the architect of the world for a day. Like what would you
think the pandemic is enough? You want more?
What could realistically be done differently? I mean, if institutions collapse, like universities or charities, a lot of people will suffer.
Yes, I don't think any of our institutions as we know them as such will entirely collapse. That's not going to happen. What will happen is a culling of the size and the quantity of institutions offering exactly the same kinds of services. We will see a culling of that range. I mean, we were really going in a very strange direction, if you think about it. We were going in the direction of plenty that wasn't necessarily absolutely necessary. And I think what's almost happening, and it does have some religious thinking around it, is that, that was a bit much. That was a bit much. We had just gone into this realm of plenty money, plenty rich, plenty institutions, plenty NGOs, plenty of everything. And we weren't necessarily actually serving the very main basis that we were created for much better. Even the United Nations is a behemoth with any stretch of the imagination. It's a behemoth of an institution and an organization. And even before any of this happened, already in the lead up to 2015, the question was, is this institution fit for purpose? And the answer was, well, let's look at this. Do we need so many different entities and bodies, each one delivering on one particular part of what a human need is? And I think the same question is going to be asked today of businesses, of health providers, of school and the educational sector. We practically had a college in every corner. It's nice that you have so much choice, but it's also, there is immediately a question which Adam Smith talked about, and I'm not a follower by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just this notion of the market has to somehow, it does intervene and cut down certain things and has its own logic. And I think what we're seeing now is that the pandemic has fast forwarded a process where the range, the number of institutions that we have will have to be fit for purpose. And that may mean actually narrowing down the range of them, the number of them, and the size of each. I think that's what we're going to be confronting, and we are confronting now.
That's very interesting. So like the pandemic is a natural cause for this kind of restructuring. Well, and another
on our own, we weren't
doing it. And yeah, and then, you know, another cause could be like a centralized administration that's more authoritative.
We're seeing a tendency towards more authoritarianism on the political spaces everywhere in the world, by the way, not just happening in one part of the world. We're seeing a tendency towards more authoritarianism everywhere in the world. As the insecurity of the average human being increases, as the insecurity of the very foundations and pillars and instruments and institutions of society becomes so high, so we see a tendency to try to seek security, to try to seek stability. And unfortunately for many human beings, there is this natural tendency, well, let's just, you know, let's get into what's clear and what's obvious. And there's too much, you know, insecurity is the biggest cause of fear in anybody's life, no matter who or what they believe in. Insecurity is fear. Fear pushes some of us towards radical, let's do this, like, what do we got to, let's do this, let's be more risky. But it pushes the majority towards, okay, safe, stable, thank you, clear, none of all that erratic stuff. It does push many of us to want something clear, guided, authority. In situations where there is popular uprising, some people say, bring in the army, bring in the... Other people say, let's use this as an opportunity to think different, out of the box, come together. The two tendencies always coexist, and plenty of others in between. And I think there is a rising tendency towards wanting the authority, insisting on the imposition of authority, law and order, whatever it takes. We see that happen. We are seeing that happen. We are living in the midst of it in this country. It's not just in this country. So yes, we're seeing authoritarianism.
Yeah, but you know, it seems like we're heading in the wrong direction. Like the adjustments are not in a positive direction, they're in a negative direction. Things are breaking down, public discourse is breaking down, and also, you know, civil society. So
that happened before the pandemic. That was already happening before the pandemic. You remember, we were already concerned about authoritarian tendencies, about even elections, which brought certain very populist perspectives into the space. We were already talking about a shrinking civil space globally.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. But when we add this very potent ingredient of the pandemic to that mix, you know, we could have imagined that catalyzing us into a better place or a worse place. And it seems like it's pulling us down even further. What do you think?
I would tend to disagree with that, because I think, for instance, that, well, it depends on, you know, is the glass half full or half empty, right?
Yeah.
And yours truly usually sees the half empty. But when you put it this way, then I feel compelled to say, wait a minute, let's look at what else is happening around us that's actually part of this unraveling that is also at the same time remarkable. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is an absolutely remarkable movement. I think I'm learning something every day. I think it is positing so much knowledge, ideas, creativity, reconfiguring of what we thought was pretty straightforward. We're having to question so many of the assumptions all of us had in all societies. Why is that a bad thing? I think it's happening because there's something extraordinarily bad in all societies, something deeply rotten in all societies. Yes, the reason for it is extraordinarily horrible, but the movement and what it symbolizes, what it is leading to, what it is forcing us to see and to do and to reconfigure, it's fantastic. We need it. We absolutely needed this. So I don't see it as, oh my gosh, anarchy and whatever. I'm saying, thank God that this is now happening, and we're all forced to question our so-called assumptions of egalitarianism, and we've got God, we can't do wrong, and all that stuff, for lack of a better word, that we had sort of made into normal. And it took such a push, it took such a horrible push from certain administrations, from certain political rhetoric around the world, from certain actions. It took a push that made it seem, okay, well, you know what, that's it. Now we have to see our truth. These facing moments of truth, and the methodology that is what is the Black Lives Matter, precisely in its completely uncoordinated work. It's not something that you actually can put into one organization. It's not institutionalized. And that's part of its beauty. It's not an institutionalized thing yet.
This is great. You know, I'm usually the half glass full type of person. So, but suddenly I became the half empty and you became the half full. So this is a good conversation. I want to take you to another part of the blog that I've been referring to, where you say it is imperative that we ensure religious beliefs and praxis are fully in alignment with human rights principles and law. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, does this mean that religions must follow secular human rights discourse? And what should religions do if they find themselves, in conflict with certain aspects of what we consider established in human rights?
So I think that there's a big business of mythology around the supposed tensions between religion and human rights. I think there's been a mythology around that created for many, many years. And I like to break that mythology into pieces. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as we know it today, would not have come into existence had we not had the religious elements. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on the values common to all religions. It didn't come from the ether. It came from, what are our common values? What do we have in common that we think is so important that it should be our universal values, right? That was the question that led to the eventual, what we today see as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and human rights. So human rights are actually predicated upon, derived from, if you will, the best of that which all religions maintain at the same time. It's inherent to religion. If we didn't have religion, we would not have had human rights, quite frankly. It's as simple as all it takes is just studying the history of how human rights came into being and what it was and how that, you realize, you know what, there were religious leaders and institutions who were part of that consultative process, and the quintessential question predicate upon which then became this body of human rights was, what do we all have in common? What are the values we all have in common? What are the dreams and aspirations we all have in common? There's not a single religion out there that says you have to go out and kill somebody. You absolutely must go and kill. You absolutely must go and steal. That it is part of your religion to go and commit adultery. No religion maintains any of those issues as you've got to do this. In fact, if you read the 18 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can find their equivalent. You will find their equivalent in all the different religious traditions, actually. And there's a beautiful document that was prepared over many, many years by the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And it's called Faith for Rights, right? Hashtag Faith for Rights. Check it out. They've gone through the 18 articles of the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they have convened the religious scholars, the religious leaders around, wait, does this speak to any of you? How does it speak to you? Where is, and provided where in almost every single religious tradition, there is a backing for that article. There is a root of that article. So the mythology needs to be readjusted a little bit. You wouldn't have had human rights if you didn't have the religious values that it is inherent on and built on. So I think when we say we now need to make sure that we use that modicum of the human rights law, international human rights law, as a way of us being able to gauge how the religious live and coexist and serve and are valuable, you're simply using a mirror that came from all of these religions. It's the mirror that is now
codified into law, which is international human rights law, right? Some Muslims argue you don't need any of that. You just go back to the Islamic Sharia and you see there and you'll find everything you need, and we actually don't need human rights law. That's grand if you live in a world in which Sharia is the prevailing way of thinking and every single person around you is quite comfortable with that. Thank you. We live in a world of nation states. Nation states have signed on to shared values and the legal basis of those values. The legislative framework for those values, that's international human rights law. So we want to live together in this joint planet that we are destroying at a fantastic rate. If we want to live together on this planet, let's find with the legal framework, because we all agree, I think, and I sincerely hope, we all agree that we need law. Laws we need very much. We also all celebrate our diversity very much. So, hey, what keeps us together? Well, we have nation states, they have their national legislation. We also have international human rights law, which is meant to be what the national laws accurately reflect. It's that code for all. So why would we be afraid of it? Why would we try to put it away? Why would we try to pretend that our own religion, our own mode of existence is the only one necessary if we're living in a world where others live around us who don't see that, who don't understand it? So let's use a framework which actually everybody pretty much can understand, and that does codify the values that are common to all. And it is legislatively codified. Those are the international human rights laws. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. Do we continue to amend them? Of course we do. We amend the constitutions of our nations. We would not amend international human rights law. We have continued over the years. And that is part of us living together. It is part of us challenging one another, but it is there.
Thank you. This is so tremendously rich. So one of the most important books, we started talking, about the double-edged nature of religion. Mm-hmm. And there's a really nice book by Scott Appleby that captures, the essence of that in this beautiful title, The Ambivalence of the Sacred. And the foreword that was written by Father Hesburgh to that book, he says the following. He says, "The prejudice against religion is strongest among secularized professionals who read page 1 of the newspapers and know a bit of history." And similar sentiments you can see. I was reading a few weeks ago Olivia Wilkinson's new book on secular and religious dynamics in humanitarian response. Evelyn Bush, in her 2007 article on measuring religion in global civil society, she says, global culture is a secular culture. So I guess building on, the question of human rights, I think you've answered it that, does it require a shift to a secular frame? Or can it actually emerge from within the traditions themselves? I think there's a deeper discussion to be had, but really appreciated your perspective on this. But in your professional career, what is the dominant attitude to religion that you found among world leaders, diplomats, CEOs, even academics? Are they typically neutral, sympathetic, or hostile to religion? Is there, just one final prompt to this, is there an elite versus masses divide when it comes to religion in the modern world?
That's a lot of questions in one. I think I would try to parcel out, if you'll allow me. First
Please,
of all,
take any part of it.
It depends on the context that you're talking. So I worked in so many different countries and so many different kinds of institutions. I worked in an NGO in the Middle East. I worked in an NGO in Europe. I worked in intergovernmental settings in Europe, but also in Africa. So it honestly depends on what setting we're talking about. There isn't one sort of global setting, if you will, and all, again, it goes back to how institutions are, what they're doing, where they're based, and how they're structured, how they run, etc. My experience has led me to a few thoughts on the matter of this so-called secularized professional, and I would have loved to know what is intended by that, because I know a lot of religious actors who will read page 1 of the newspaper and nothing else and walk away and that's it. So I don't really think that it's just a secular person who does that. Newspapers of today, you can see that many people won't want to read the rest of it. But to be serious, I think that the international policy infrastructure that we have in the form of the United Nations, the European Union, etc. Those kinds of institutions are indeed built upon a particular secular ethos. And if you think about it, if you're trying to bring, let's look at the United Nations as an example. If you're trying to bring 193 governments together, 193 governments together regularly to address issues relevant to all of them, each in their own way, each with their own nation and its issues and its problems. If you do something like that, you do need a terrain that isn't influenced either way towards any particular religious space, because we agree religion is that very heartbeat of our existence, those of us who believe. It's the very heartbeat of our existence. So if you're going to convene 193 governments, you're likely to find plenty of heartbeats that may not necessarily be beating in unison. And it's hard enough to get two governments to see eye to eye on the most contentious issues that each of which per definition is everything that we are confronted with today. It's already very, very difficult to get consensus between two governments. Can you imagine what it's like between 193 when you then bring in the religious ingredient of the heartbeat and the way of seeing a particular worldview? Yes, if we're lucky, they'll all be in great unison together because the spirit affects them all similarly, and they just all see the good in everybody all the time. Now, we know that never happens that way. There are already so many points of disagreement. You want to seriously add religion to that mix? Do you really want to add religion to that mix of dissonance that is already beautiful in its diversity, shall we say, putting it very politically correctly? I think if you start putting the religious mixture in, it will only become even more disruptive to the dynamic of working together as 193 governments. So the challenge is how do you not eliminate religion altogether? Because you can't eliminate the heartbeat. You really can't. But my goodness, the Western world has tried very hard, and especially Western Europe has tried really valiantly for quite some time. The challenge is that we go from one extreme to the other. No religion at all, no religion in the public space. Religion is your private business, keep it your private business, don't bring it up here. To the other extreme, which is we can do nothing without religion. We cannot think without religion. We cannot live without religion. Those are two extremes, quite frankly. Ergo, the call for international human rights law, because hey guys, we've already codified it. What is it that is going to be good for all and right for all and just as much as possible? Can we please look at that? Because if you're going to start talking about, the Buddha and the Prophet Muhammad and how they did this and what you think that means, and we might take a longer time to actually come to that space of here's what we need to do. So my sense is you can't take religion out of the picture entirely, nor can you make it the sole focus of policy, legislation, worldviews, you name it. And our challenge has been, I think, that as a result, not so much of religion, but as a result of colonialism, the colonial legacy that we all seem to think we're supposed to completely overlook because it happened 60 years ago. How do you erase a human memory and the subconscious so nicely with a certain amount of years? I don't know. Look at the pain and the dissonance and the anger and the triumphalism about the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which goes back, I don't know how many centuries. And you think, oh, really? And we're supposed to forget colonialism. That's very interesting. We forget colonialism. Why? Because it happened with the Western world, implemented it. Some Western European nations had this colonial experience. So therefore 50 years is a good eraser. You can erase it, but we don't erase anything else that's lasted far longer, that was even much more before in history. We don't erase that. We remember that because that hurts. There's still a legacy there. So the colonial legacy is what we need to question. And I think the colonial legacy, one of its many manifestations is that the institutions that we have today, especially the institutions that have to do with global governance, have indeed and do indeed operate with a very Western secular ethos. We keep religion out. But it's these very same institutions, Mahan, who are today reconnecting, re-engaging with religion and religious actors, who are today seeking. Each of these governments in the UN system is now inviting different religious actors to the table to converse with them as to what can we do in times of COVID, amongst the many other things that they're doing. So it's actually these same so-called secular governments who are and have been spearheading an engagement with religious actors.
Lovely. So I don't want to be Hegelian, but just, you know, maybe history has moved from like all religion to no religion to finding the right balance, which is very interesting. What you said was, you know, it's the heartbeat. You can't take it out or you die, but you also can't have it only a heartbeat. It needs to be
how many times a day do you think of your heartbeat?
Right. It's a lovely metaphor. And I think, you know, this blog I've been referring to of yours, maybe in closing, you can just say a few words about the title, which I think is capturing this idea that we're floating around. And the title of the blog was Working with Religion or Working for Faith. And it's like a question. So why did you title the blog this way?
Because I see that what is happening around us is this, what I've just been talking about, is the re-engagement by certain governments, by most governments, quite frankly, because some governments in the world have always been engaging in using religion. There's nothing new there. They're old hands at using religion. Some relatively newer entrants into the space of using religion are actually the Western governments. And I see that some of that engagement often instrumentalizes religion quite a bit. So it's working with religion because you believe that the religious actors can serve the purpose of a political or financial or a public health or whatever agenda. You believe that the religious actors have something to provide, which is right, which is true. They do. But then do you work with them? Is the predominant paradigm. Let's work with these religious actors, yes? And the assumption is that when you work with these religious actors, you are becoming more religiously and culturally sensitive. You are, you know, furthering the cause of spirituality and religious well-being and etc. And I think there's wisdom to pause and to say, wait a minute, this happens to be a religious partner that I'm working with, and I'm working with them pretty much the same way I'm working with everybody else who are non-religious, because we have some common agendas and objectives. That is not the same, and that should not be, this, in my opinion, the same as working because you are inspired by your faith, because you want to serve faith. And it's the difference between me working with a religious NGO partner or not, and me working because I believe that there's an inherent value to service in the name of the divine, to just serve in the name of the divine. And it is a service that is not conditioned by the context of who I'm serving. It is almost exclusively driven by the hunger to serve, because that's what the divine commanded me. That's how I find the divine. It is in the act of service that I find the divine. And so I serve. And that is, to me, that is akin to working for faith. That's working for faith. And it doesn't matter what the faith is. For many, it does. Of course, it matters, but in a sense, it doesn't matter. You work for faith. You work for the faith. It's not the same, and shouldn't be the same as working with religion and religious actors. To me, there's a big difference between wanting to bring to serve the people, anyone, whoever they are, because they need, and doing it because I believe that that's what I'm supposed to do. That's what I will be judged by when it comes my time to judge. I will be judged by whether I have served or not.
And between wanting to do that because there's such a partnership and we're going to deliver more and it's going to be better and it's going to, that's great. That's great. That has to happen too. But they are two different forms of, I think, existence. And what I'm seeing happen is that the faith aspect is becoming used as an explanation for yet another business as usual international development or humanitarian or international relations kind of partnership. Let's work together because we have businesses, we have intentions and good things to do together. That's fine. That's how we work. That's how our secular world works. But I think there's a big difference between that and working for faith.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was Azza Karam, Professor of Religion and Development, Secretary General for Religions for Peace, and Advisory Board Member at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. And thank you also to all our listeners. Please follow our Twitter feed at AnsariUND or visit our website ansari.nd.edu to stay in touch.